Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar. We are excited about having a wonderful presentation by two terrific researchers today. I'm Shelley Billig, I'm representing REL Central. We're in the midst of doing a number of different kinds of projects around closing the achievement gap and understanding how achievement can be improved in rural districts and schools.
And I'm going to introduce Dr. Matthew Irvin. He is an assistant professor of educational psychology and research in the Department of Educational Studies at the University of South Carolina. Previously, he was a research scientist at the National Research Center on Rural Education Support at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and his work was funded by IES. He did several large-scale survey research studies and cluster randomized controlled trial studies in rural schools across the country. And at the University of South Carolina, his collaboration has focused on STEM education in high-needs rural schools. This afternoon, Dr. Irvin will share an overview of his work on the effective use of online learning in rural schools, with a particular focus on the effective use of learner-centered principles from an experimental study on student retention in distance education courses in rural schools. Kind of a mouthful there. But welcome, Dr. Irvin, and you're on for your presentation.
To first kind of give some background information and data that we gathered as part of a rural distance education survey. I'll go over some of our findings and work involved a phone survey with rural districts across the country there. And as it notes here, these really helped develop the Facilitator preparation program, and that's where we use the learner-centered principles to improve the support rural kids are getting while they're taking advanced online courses. So, and then that's what we did the randomized controlled trial on to test the effectiveness of that intervention. So, and the support that the kids were getting as a result of that. So, go on next slide, please. So first, the rural distance education survey. Broadly, we wanted to look at rural districts' use of distance education across the country, and we wanted to look at some specific things like the prevalence, how frequently they had been or were using distance education, barriers they may be encountering, the subjects they were trying to use distance education to provide students, what was the format that they were delivering the distance education or when they were using it, how satisfied they were, and the degree that students completed it and were prepared for it to start. So these were phone interviews that we did with superintendents for 400 randomly selected small and low-income rural school districts. These were meeting the definition of small and low-income rural schools by the REL program that the federal government started. We mostly about 95% completion rate, and most of those were superintendents. In a few cases, superintendents would tell us that they weren't the best person. They maybe had like a district technology coordinator or something of that nature, but they said they were the best person to talk to. So in a few small cases, a number of cases, we talked to them instead. So next slide, please. So broadly, some key findings from that work were that 85% of these small and low-income rural school districts had used or were using distance education. And a big percentage of those, 81%, needed it to provide advanced or enrichment courses. So we thought this was really important. You know, there are some national reports that suggest that rural schools use distance education more often, maybe even twice as much as urban and or suburban schools, but they're obviously using it here for a particular need to provide these advanced or enrichment courses. So we also found that they most often used online courses in particular versus some other sort of form like TV or something. And they used them in particular to provide foreign language and algebra most frequently. Those were two of the highest frequency subjects that they were using distance education for. So we also asked them about how well prepared their students were for taking these distance education classes, and they indicated that they were very well prepared in terms of their computer skills, and that their academic background had very well prepared them too. But much less of the respondents said that the students were very, very well prepared excuse me, in terms of study skills. So this was something that we really keyed in on for our study. How might we help kids in rural areas if they're not prepared in terms of their study skills for taking these advanced enrichment courses. So next slide, please. So we also asked about various barriers. This is pretty common in research and online and distance learning. A lot of work out there on clusters of barriers, different types of barriers. So following that, we asked about similar things that have been asked previously in the research. So we asked about some district barriers. And these were kind of just conceptually grouped here into district barriers, logistical barriers, and personnel barriers. So going back to district barriers, we found that 68% said they did not need them for a curriculum requirement, and that was a barrier for them. So this probably reflects the fact that, again, they're using this distance education for online, advanced enrichment courses versus, meeting their basic needs, basic requirements. So, and then 64% indicated that a barrier was funding issues, and substantial proportion there, 53%, also said it wasn't a district priority. So, and then in terms of some logistical barriers, 59% thought it was a barrier with scheduling issues, and others generally said it was just difficult to implement. And then in terms of personnel, these were the next or the last most frequent barriers, that they said that they didn't have the personnel trained to support distance education, or not available at all to support. So several of these other things, not needing them for curriculum requirements, funding issues, in terms of thinking about an intervention we could do and program we could do to help them more effectively use distance education. These are things we felt we probably couldn't address, but having personnel trained to support distance education was something we felt we could address. So we kind of keyed in on that as well with our Facilitator preparation program. So next slide, please. So a few other findings from the distance education survey, looking at their satisfaction with the distance education and what that related to. We found that as students' computer skills and those study skills that you may recall were lower, as those increased, the districts were more satisfied. And they're also more satisfied when they used a synchronous delivery format, so more real-time online formats where you have live, real-time access to instructors, but they more often used asynchronous delivery formats, and it was not related to any differences in their satisfaction. So we interpreted this as, when they do use, and they again use asynchronous delivery formats more often, that at least it wasn't a problem in terms of their satisfaction. So next slide, please. So again, that survey data and some of our findings there helped us think about what we wanted to do in our intervention program, and we focused in and developed the Facilitator preparation program, where we focused in on the school-based facilitators or mentors to again try to improve the training support that they had at the school to help rural youth who were taking advanced online classes. So part of the rationale for this was that we know learning is comparable in online courses when they complete a course, but that's a major issue, that often in online courses students don't complete the course, much higher dropout rate than a traditional face-to-face class. So we wanted to, in the Facilitator preparation program, try and increase how long students stayed in the course and whether they then, of course, completed it. So could we reduce dropout? Next slide, please. So we developed the Facilitator preparation program. It was a web-based, completely online training program. We actually implemented it in course Blackboard platform that many of you may be familiar with. We also used learner-centered principles from American Psychological Association. They have broadly 4 domains: cognitive, metacognitive, motivational, affective, developmental and social, and individual differences. And there's, I'm looking at them now, like 14 principles, many different ones under each of these domains, but broadly, like the cognitive and metacognitive domain talks about things like what's the nature of the learning process and how when we're more engaged, we better learn complex material. We learn better when we try to construct and use existing knowledge. Being strategic thinker is really important, and using higher order strategies to try and self-regulate and achieve your learning goals are important. So in terms of motivational and affective factors, of course talk about motivation there and how important motivation is, especially intrinsic motivation to learn. You know, that is your natural curiosity and interest in things. And then in terms, motivation really affects your effort and how much effort you put into learning. So in terms of developmental and social factors, the learner-centered principles talk about that there are developmental impacts on our learning, the opportunities we have to learn, our learning experiences, and that these also place constraints on what we have the opportunity to learn. So, and then social factors are also important. Our peer relations, our interactions with teachers. You know, a lot of research showing that teacher-student relationships are a very, very important factor in learning. So that goes into the social factor here. And then lastly, the importance of individual differences, that we have different strategies for learning. Learners are diverse. We have different cultural, linguistic backgrounds that need to be taken into account. So those are the learner-centered principles that we really try to use and incorporate, and a lot of research has shown that you know, these essentially are the most important principles of development and learning for youth, and they do apply to online distance education settings as well. So next slide, please. So we presented the facilitators some information on the learner-centered principles, some background information on those, and then we also had developed some scenarios and provided them scenarios that depicted issues students often encounter in some online courses. We had done some pilot work and worked with some course providers previously to identify some of these issues that students have. So we developed these scenarios, and they were provided over the course of first 2-3 weeks of the class, and they were delivered in multiple media format. It involved text and audio clip and images depicting these situations and issues that students have. So for a little more detail about these, some of them obviously address time management, which is huge in general for kids, but especially in online settings. Had a kid in the video who tended to procrastinate and is discussing this issue with their facilitator, and they're sort of brainstorming ideas of how to address you know, time management and do a better job of that. Motivation and engagement, how students sometimes get disengaged with classes, and particularly online classes, how they might be having difficulties continuing to be motivated and doing their work on time when they don't have a teacher right there. So again, then brainstorming strategies for how to address those things. So we asked them to, the facilitators, to discuss the learner-centered principles that were apparent in these scenarios and how they could apply those to support rural students in particular. So, and I should mention the facilitators were actually in this online course with each other from other facilitators all across the country, so they were interacting with each other over this training material. Next slide, please. And that was essentially the online facilitator community that we tried to develop early on and as part of the intervention. and then try to continue throughout the year. So we really wanted them to kind of work together to help understand, these ideas and how it best applies for helping rural youth. So next slide, please. Another key component of the Facilitator preparation program was data-based feedback and some ongoing professional development. So we actually had students and facilitators complete an online survey of these learner-centered principles, and the degree to which the domains and the related factors I briefly discussed were apparent in their relationship between the student and the facilitator and in that on-site classroom setting with them. So we aggregated these results to the classroom level, the on-site classroom level, and then shared those, de-identified of course, with the facilitators to talk about. Here's what you say is going on, here's what the students say is going on, and what can we do to improve that if there's a discrepancy, or both show that maybe something in particular is low. So next slide, please. And this is, essentially talks about that we use that in this feedback session where we had phone conversations with them and discussed the results and talked about, again, ideas for trying to improve things when they need to be improved. Okay, next slide. So we developed the Facilitator preparation program, and then we wanted to evaluate the effects of it in a cluster randomized control trial where we had facilitators randomly assigned to the control or an intervention condition, and the facilitators who were in the control condition, they received the standard training that the online course provider provided all facilitators. So it's not that they got nothing, they got business as usual here. And those that were randomly assigned to the intervention condition, they also got the business as usual, plus the additional information and scenarios and such that I talked about that were part of the Facilitator preparation program. So essentially it was an add-on to the standard business as usual. Next slide, please. So the students, they took a year-long AP English literature course, and we had two distinct groups or cohorts of students. We had a group of students in 2007 and 2008 academic year, and then the 08-09 year. Across both years or groups of students, and they were distinct, by the way, meaning it was a completely different group of students in 08-09 as it was in 07-08. So different schools, different facilitators, different students all together in the second year. Over the course of the 2 years of the project, we had more than 700 students in more than 90 rural schools all across the country. Next slide, please. And just a brief depiction here of where we were all across the country. Interestingly, we weren't in the southeast much. One of the sort of incentives of the project was that we provided the online AP English literature course for free. But many schools in the southeast, we found, were already implementing online distance education and didn't need it. Already had, some like even Florida Virtual High School was already in place. North Carolina Virtual High School was coming online as well. So many of the school districts in the southeast, were interested. But otherwise, we're, obviously across the rest of the country here. Next slide, please. So to show you some of the effects of the Facilitator preparation program on course dropout, I've included this table here. So the first line there, the intervention line, it shows a negative 0.260. So that means that overall there was a main effect of the intervention on course dropout, reduced course dropout. There was also a cohort effect. So the second line there for cohort 2, a minus 3.19, shows that cohort 2 had a lower dropout rate themselves compared to the first group of students, so the students in 07 and 08. And then jumping down to the last one here, the intervention by cohort line of a positive 3.78, there was an interaction, is what that indicates, between the intervention and cohorts. And there was an intervention effect in cohort 1, the first year students, but not for the second year students. So we did find an effect that maintained in the first year, but not carried on into the second year, or second cohort. So, and next slide. Yeah, I think that's it. That's some citations of some of the work that I've been talking about, and where you can find some of this information here from the Rural Distance Education Survey. And then next slide, the work here on the Facilitator Preparation Program.
Dr. Peggy Clements is a senior researcher with American Institutes for Research. Much of her current work focuses on the use of technology to support teaching and learning with a focus on mathematics education. She has led multiple randomized controlled trial studies, including the one that we'll talk about here, and also an examination of the impact of big math for little kids on pre-K and kindergarten students' learning of math. She is going to discuss findings from an experimental study on the effects of online mathematics courses for grade 8 students in rural schools in Maine and Vermont. Welcome, Dr. Clements.
So just as REL Central is presenting this webinar as part of their REL program, the study I'm going to talk about today was conducted as part of the REL program, but actually a previous iteration of the REL program. So the set of RELs that existed back before 2012. So this study was conducted by REL Northeastern Islands. REL Northeastern Islands was and is at Education Development Center. This particular study was a collaboration between researchers at EDC and American Institutes for Research. It's a big study. It's kind of a complicated study. I've done my best to really focus my talk today on the points I think will be of most interest to attendees. Later on at the end of my slides, and I think at the end of my presentation, the organizers will give you a link to this report that I show here on the slide. And the executive summary of the report is going to offer a lot more details if you have questions, and I'll do my best to answer all the questions that you have today. Next slide, please. Actually, there's one more thing I want to say before I get started. We were conducting this study at about the same time Matt was conducting the study. He was talking about their AP English study. So if we had had those findings, it would have helped us inform our plans for this study, but we didn't have them then, although I do refer to them often at this point. So as many of us know, taking Algebra 1 is a gateway course. And for students, for advanced students, it's a gateway course to being able to take more advanced math and science courses in high school. Over the past decade or so, and certainly since the National Mathematics Advisory Panel report came out, many schools have been moving to offer Algebra 1 in the 8th grade. But it's not possible for all schools, and in particular, it's not possible for a lot of rural middle grade schools to offer Algebra 1 to students because they don't have the resources. Having a teacher who's certified to teach Algebra 1 can be a challenging thing for a middle grade school to be able to access, and typically rural schools are small. And so if you look at, say for example, an entire cohort of 8th graders that's maybe 40 students, the percentage of those students that's going to be ready to take Algebra 1 is going to be relatively small. And so the feasibility of offering a special, a particular class for a very small group of students is outside of what's feasible for a lot of rural schools. So at this point, I also just want to pause and just make one point about the study really clear. This study is not about offering Algebra 1 to all 8th grade students. It's about offering Algebra 1, or in particular, expanding access to Algebra 1 for 8th grade students who are academically ready to take algebra in the 8th grade. And so really that's what we set out to do. We set out to see whether offering an Algebra 1 class via an online format to rural 8th grade students was an effective way to not just increase their access to this course, but to improve the educational outcomes that we link or expect from kids who've been able to take Algebra 1 in the 8th grade. We conducted the study in, not entirely, but almost completely in rural schools in Vermont and Maine. In the participating schools, the average 8th grade cohort size, so the average number of 8th graders overall in these schools, was about 27 students. So we're talking about small schools. And in these schools, about 25% of those students, of the 8th grade students, were deemed to be academically ready for Algebra 1 in the 8th grade. So here again, we're talking about between 6 and 7 students in each school, and you can see why it's really not feasible for most rural middle grade schools to offer Algebra 1 to students, to their academically ready 8th grade students. So let's go to the next slide, please. So it's important to put this study in the context of 8th grade mathematics and what's going on. So what did it mean for schools, for middle grade schools in the study? What did it mean for them to not offer a full Algebra 1 course? It meant a lot of different things, right? So these teachers were absolutely doing the best that they could to provide students with a mathematics instruction that was going to be challenging to them. And so this took different formats. For some schools, it might be that a handful of students were sitting in the back of the classroom working in an Algebra 1 textbook with a teacher helping them when it was possible. In some settings, if schedules and transportation allowed, students would travel to the high school to take Algebra 1. But that's, certainly not going to be a big solution for most schools, because lots of kids don't have a parent who can drive them there when they're in the 9th grade. But it's also really important to keep in mind that a typical 8th grade mathematics curriculum includes, it varies by curricula, but really includes a significant focus on algebraic content, right? So they're not teaching Algebra 1, but there is a lot of algebraic content that's part of the typical 8th grade curriculum. So again, the criteria for schools to be part of this study were that they were going to have students who were ready to take algebra in the 8th grade, and that they didn't offer a full Algebra 1 course to all of the students who were ready for it, right? All right, so let's go to the next slide, please. So the policy relevant question here then, just to reiterate what I've been saying, is that, in schools that don't offer Algebra 1 to 8th graders, and in particular, in middle grade schools, is it beneficial to offer Algebra 1 as an online course? Where by benefits we mean algebra achievement. So hopefully, do students know more algebra at the end of the year, which is what we would hope if we've offered them an online algebra course. But importantly, do students who have access to this online Algebra 1 course have the opportunity to take more advanced mathematics courses once they get into high school? Does it put them on an advanced math course-taking trajectory? And once again, I just want to point out that the study was really that we were targeting the access to online Algebra 1 to the students who were, quote-unquote, algebra ready or academically ready to take Algebra 1. So the specific and primary research questions, next slide please, that the study addressed, again, just saying the same thing just a little bit differently, is what is the impact of offering an online Algebra 1 course to algebra-ready students on their algebra achievement at the end of the 8th grade? And does offering an online Algebra 1 course to these algebra-ready students affect the likelihood of their being able to participate in an advanced mathematics course sequence once they get into high school? I'd like to point out the study also addressed a number of secondary questions. Being able to talk about them is not within the scope of this presentation, but again, I refer you to the report, and in particular, the executive summary. The report is 100 pages long, so I don't think you want to read the whole thing. But the executive summary provides a nice overview of everything. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned a second ago, this was an experimental study. It was a randomized controlled trial. We recruited 68 schools in Maine and Vermont to participate in the study. We asked schools to give us a list of all of the students who they had identified as being academically ready for Algebra 1 once they got into the 8th grade. And then we randomly assigned schools to either the treatment group, which had access to the Algebra 1 online curriculum during the study year, or schools were randomly assigned, and by that I also mean, we performed a lottery, so everybody had an equal probability of being in either group. So schools were either assigned to be in the treatment group and had access to the online Algebra 1 course, or they were assigned to the control group, and we asked those schools to teach mathematics the same to all the 8th graders in the same way they would have had they not heard about the study. Before you go to the next slide, I want to just reiterate that the results I'm going to be talking about today are the results that are relevant specifically about the Algebra 1, the Algebra Ready students. So not the other students, talking just about the kids who are ready to take Algebra 1. Next slide, please. Given our research questions, it makes sense that our measures, our outcome measures, would be an Algebra Achievement Test score. It was an algebra test that we gave all students at the end of the 8th grade. And our other measure was high school math course taking. So we followed students through the end of the 9th grade and went to all these student schools and were able to collect data about what math courses those students were registered for the 10th grade. So the study couldn't follow students throughout their high school career, but we were able to at least know what were the courses that students were planning to take by the time they got into the 10th grade. Hoping to see if whether or not having access to Algebra 1 in the 8th grade had put them on a more advanced course-taking trajectory. All right, the next slide, please. Just a little bit about the course. So it was an asynchronous online course. All of the content was online. There was a certified teacher, an online certified teacher who was available to students, but being an asynchronous course, what that meant was that typically students and teachers were not online at the same time. Each school was asked, we asked each school to identify and appoint an on-site facilitator, or basically the person at the school who would oversee and support the students who were enrolled in the online courses. Before I tell, next slide please. Before I tell you about the findings, so the findings in terms of the impact of the course on students' math outcomes, I want to tell you a little bit about what we saw in the online courses. So we know lots of people are turning to online courses because they do have the potential to increase access and to advanced learning opportunities and create access to lots of different kinds of learning opportunities. But we don't know a lot, I would say, about what is really going on in online courses. And certainly all online course providers vary, and how schools implement online courses really varies. But we did, in our study, look at pretty carefully at the online teacher practices as well as the practices of the school folks, the school facilitators who were on-site supporting the kids in the online courses. So the expectation, and these were the expectations stated by the online course provider, is that the online teachers would log into the course management system every day to both monitor students' progress in the course and to communicate with students. What we found in terms of monitoring was that, almost without a doubt, and we did these observations online using back-end data, but in almost all observation periods, we saw that the online teacher did log into the learning management system, and we saw that in 70% of these situations, the online teacher monitored student login activities, so we could see that they went and looked at which students had logged into the course. And we could also see that in 43% of our observations that the online teacher had gone in to examine, monitor students' grades, where they were in the course and what their grades were. Next slide, please. The other expectation was about communication, and the expectation from, again, the online course provider was that the online teachers would communicate directly with students every day. What we saw was that, in almost all the observations, it's true that the online teacher did send at least one message to students in almost all of the observations. About half of the messages were administrative, typically about pacing, reminding students that they needed to complete a unit or whether or not they were on track to complete the course by the end of the year. Something along, a lot of it had to do with pacing, quite honestly, or how long a particular test would still be available for students to take online. And only about 13% of the messages addressed course content. And when I say these were both messages that teachers could send directly to the students, so the teacher might have initiated the message, these might also represent, or they do also represent, messages that teachers sent to students in response to a message the student had sent. So 13% of the messages addressed math content, and 3% of the students enrolled in the online courses were involved in those communications. And just without too much detail, these observations, we didn't observe all the data for all 180 academic days. We randomly selected 8 24-hour periods in which we looked at these data, but they were a good representation both across the entire academic year. Next slide, please. Another thing to keep in mind about the study is we had asked schools, required of them to appoint a school staff member to serve as the on-site monitor. It was up to them to appoint whoever they wanted to appoint. What we saw in these schools, now keep in mind these are middle schools in small rural schools, and what we saw were that, so let's see, forward this slide just a little bit. What we saw was that in 80% of the schools, they had actually appointed the person who would have been the student's 8th grade math teacher to be the monitor, and so these students ended up just sitting in the back of the classroom with a laptop. That's how they went through the course. What we saw, and this is one of the things that surprised us, is that each of the monitors reported spending an average of 50 minutes per week answering students' questions about math. So this is a little bit misleading. The median was closer to half an hour, and it's also important to keep in mind that this is the total number of minutes they spent answering questions for all of the students they were overseeing. But the important point to take away, I think, is that that the way school set it up, the mentor was the math teacher, and that, not surprisingly, these 8th grade students turned to their math teacher, the person in the room with them, to ask questions about mathematics. Next slide, please. All right, so got a couple minutes, and now we're going to talk about the results. So these numbers are just a little bit out of the blue because it's this math test. It's hard to know what 447 and 441 means, but basically what we saw was that, and again, this was sort of the minimum that we expected, was that students in the treatment school, the algebra-ready students in the treatment schools that had had access to the online course, they performed better on an end-of-course algebra test than students in the control group. And again, that's totally what we would have expected. They had access to an Algebra 1 course. Effect size, that's basically, it's a little researchy term. I kind of, in retrospect, seeing who our participants are, I wish I hadn't included it. Basically, it's a standardized difference, mean difference score between the two groups. And anytime in education we see an effect size of over 0.25, a number of us consider that to be an educationally meaningful difference, and so that's what we have here, this effect size of 0.40. Next slide, please. In our mind, really the targeted outcome for this study was whether students who had had access to the online course were more likely to be engaged in an advanced math course-taking trajectory by the time they were in the 10th grade, and that definitely was the case. If the students, the algebra-ready students who were in the treatment schools had a 51% probability, or they were their probability was 0.51 of being enrolled in an advanced math course-taking sequence, compared to the control schools. And I'm just going to translate this. This isn't exactly right, so the researchers in the audience, please excuse me. Another way, I think, to understand this is that about half of the students who had had access to the online Algebra 1 course were enrolled in an advanced math course taking sequence at the end of the 9th grade, compared to about 26% of the students in the control schools. And remember, in the control schools, kids still could have been at the back of the classroom. They still could have had access to the an Algebra 1 course through their high school, or their schools could have decided to use an online course for them after hearing about the possibility and enrolling in the study. So about 20% of the students in the control schools had access to a full Algebra 1 course. And in a number of the cases, those students were enrolled in an online algebra course. All right. So next slide, please. This is, straight from the report. We really think that the results suggest that offering an online algebra course, to these Algebra 1, to these algebra-ready 8th grade students is an effective way to broaden access to this specific course, and importantly, later to more challenging mathematics course opportunities. Next slide, please. And here is a link. This link, I actually don't guess you have access to the link, but you can Google access to Algebra 1 advanced mathematics for grade 8 students, and you can find the report.
So we want to thank both of our presenters today for their wonderful studies in particular, and for also joining us and presenting this great webinar. We want to thank all of you listeners on behalf of REL Central. Thank you all again, and we will close this webinar now. Thank you.